So in this stream today, we're going to be thinking about 5 different things, leaving time for questions at the end from any of you. Of course, I will be answering questions as we go throughout this. So feel free to put them in the chat. I like to see a lot of chatter over there, whether it's commenting on the fact that my sound doesn't work, or my glasses are smudgy, or whatever it might be. Put where you're from, maybe where you are in the class, and then of course any questions can go there or in the Ask a Question section down at the bottom of the page. So definitely add those and we will look at them. Anyway, so what we're covering today, we're going to talk about what a thesis is and what is exactly required of the DBQ thesis. So what is it that the College Board is looking for? We're also going to talk about tips for writing thesis statements. So I have a bunch of those, and we'll talk about them. And we'll get to them in a little bit. Some of them are going to be quite obvious. You'll hear me say a million times today, and then some may not be. Then we're going to look at this sample prompt, this sample DBQ. And you can actually find that linked down in the resources to the video, to this presentation. If you go to the Fiveable page, you also will find the resource of the slides that we're going to be looking at today. And then lastly, again, we'll end with these questions. So let's just start with defining a thesis. I cobble together definitions of thesis every time, but ultimately they're basically all the same. It is a relatively brief statement that introduces an argument or claim and is supported by evidence and analysis. Now, relatively brief, we're talking 1 to maybe 3 sentences, though you could, I guess, have a longer thesis if it was extremely complex and you chopped it up a bit. But typically, when we are looking at these in the AP exam, they're 1 to 3 sentences. It is going to introduce your argument, your main claim, and that may consist of subclaims or sub-arguments that might form the body of your essay. But it is going to be the overarching thing that you're trying to prove. And hopefully those body paragraphs will contain evidence in the DBQ from our documents and from outside information that comes from your head, springs forth from your gigantic brains. That evidence which supports the body paragraphs will then in turn support this thesis. So sadly, theses don't necessarily write themselves, but they almost do. And we'll talk about that later, especially in the DBQ. So unlike the LEQ, or the long essay question, where all of the knowledge that you're expected to bring to the essay comes from your head, from what you've remembered, the DBQ, or document-based question here, is going to give you the information. It is going to tell you exactly it's going to give you the evidence to lead you to that answer. In fact, the documents are pretty well crafted in a sense that they are trying to lead you to a specific answer. And that has a twofold purpose. 1, so we can make sure that you're analyzing documents. And 2, when the readers go to read it, we see something relatively consistent. So they answer the questions in a specific way, and we'll talk about how to use those. So anyways, think about your thesis as your overall argument or claim. It needs to be specific enough that it's not just there were many similarities and differences or many changes and continuities, but it will stop short of introducing its own evidence. So somewhere in between. Now, let's think about some more characteristics of the thesis statement other than just being relatively specific to the prompt, but not so specific that it introduces evidence. Your thesis statement should answer all parts of the prompt. So when we think about what we mean by all parts, I'm really considering, if you have a multi-part thesis, if it's asking for you to evaluate the extent to which object A affected objects B and C, right? Then you would need to address both B and C in the thesis, answering all parts. If it said or, then you could choose one, but making sure that you understand that prompt so that your thesis statement really responds to the full prompt. The second thing, or the second characteristic of a thesis statement is that it introduces a plausible claim. So not just something that you made up, but something that is reasonable and true, and can be defended with evidence. So it's not just a blatant fact in its own. It's not going to be that specific, and it's not going to be so broad that it is a really sweeping opinion that no one could argue against. So you're going to be somewhere in between. Your thesis is in one or more consecutive sentences. So that's a requirement from the College Board, that it has to be consecutive sentences found in one place, either your introduction or your conclusion. Typically, you'll write it at the end of your introduction. That is where it is typically found, at the end of that introductory paragraph. And then you'll use your conclusion to maybe write your thesis in other words, especially if you find that when you're writing your body paragraphs in the draft that you might need to revise your thesis. You can do that in the conclusion. But typically, this is going to be found at the end of your introduction after you have introduced your contextualization. You'll link that to the thesis, and that'll lead into the paper. Now, what does a thesis have to have? The College Board's rubric for grading thesis, and to get this point, you must respond to the prompt with a historically defensible thesis or claim that establishes a line of reasoning. Now, I'm going to go and kind of explain each of these points. And if you're still confused, certainly ask questions. But if not, again, that video I mentioned, Melissa, she also did a nice job of this in going over the points that you can get for the thesis. So the first thing that you should do is, it's asking you to respond to the prompt. That means answer the question. This great, there's a great clip of John McEnroe that the APUSH teacher at my school used, where he's yelling at the chair. He's asking a question. He was throwing a tantrum basically, but the chair was not answering what he was asking. He was giving evasive answers, and McEnroe says, "Answer my question, jerk." We don't want to be call anybody jerks or the reader's jerk or the writers of these jerks, but you want to answer the question. The person reading your essay wants to see that you are responding to the prompt. You're not just answering something out of left field. So that's the first thing. You're just answering the question. That's what that means. Now, you're asked to do this with a historically defensible thesis or claim. The translation of that is just that it is plausible, and it can be supported by evidence. So are you claiming aliens built the pyramids? That is not historically defensible. I'm sorry, History Channel. But the claim that you're putting forth is plausible based on the evidence in front of you. So you could be making, especially with a DBQ, a claim that is unrelated to the documents. Well, that wouldn't necessarily be within the realm of the question here. And then the last thing you have to do is establish a line of reasoning. So address in your argument why or how something came about, right? So that's something that you're going to want to do. And this is, of course, if you do that, you get the point. It's perhaps a little bit easier than even maybe that vocabulary leads you to think it is. And the reason for that is there are a million different ways that you can go about responding to the prompt with a historically offensive thesis or claim that establish a line of reasoning. There are so many different ways to do this. I read for the DBQ last year, and reading hundreds of essays over the week, I found that no two really addressed the prompt in the same way. Obviously, there were some similarities in answers, but some people addressed it with historical reasoning skills of changing continuity, and some with comparison, and some with causation. And there were just so many different ways to go about this. They are purposefully writing these questions now so that you can attack them in many different ways and bring your own skills, your own experience to the question. That's what they want to see. That you can develop and make an argument. So let's talk about our tips for writing thesis statements. So tip number one, okay? Tip number one, and stop me if you've heard this before. Answer the prompt, right? That's the first thing that you have to do. I'm going to say it about 1,000,000 times. Answer the prompt. You must pay attention to that. Today, when we look at this practice, DBQ, we're going to dissect the prompt. What does it mean? What does each part of it mean? How do we go about answering it? Understanding the question is really the first step in answering it, right? Do you understand what the question is asking? And then can you respond to it? That's all part of it. Developing your initial responses to it, brainstorming categories that you can put these documents into, and then organizing them and writing, right, are the rest of it. But it really starts with understanding. So that's what you want to do. Answer that prompt, so understand it. A second tip is a short little checklist that I've used with my kids for years and years and years. And so over the years, I've had to modify it a bit with some asterisks, and I'll explain that momentarily. So in a thesis, especially in what I would consider to be like a standalone thesis, I look for certain things. The prompts that you get, if we're going to make sure we're going to address the prompt, right? Answer the prompt. The prompt usually gives us a time period that we're working within. So is your thesis addressing that time period, right? Are you writing about, if it's about labor migrations from 1450 to 1750, are you writing about that time period and not 1750 to 1900? That could change, whether your answer is correct or incorrect. So paying attention to chronology and even including that in your thesis is good. Geography, where are we talking about here in the world? Nowadays, oftentimes it opens up in the kind of global system. That's been the trend lately, but some DBQs have been really localized and talking about effects in India and Japan specifically, or in the Americas specifically. So keep that idea in mind. This is also good for LEQs as well as DBQs. Although I will say there's some asterisks next to that. And the reason why is because those two things are often nowadays introduced as context for an essay. So in that introductory paragraph, when you're introducing your contextualization and you're talking about setting this prompt in a wider context in order to understand what's going on in the world around it, usually you are including chronology and geography into that, along with any events or major things that are going on. So if you have it in your context, don't feel like you have to put it in your thesis again. This would be more so things that I would look for when you're drafting your thesis to make sure that you're in the right time period, or if your teacher teaches you to put contextualization in a paragraph after your intro. Although I advise students to put it in your introduction at the beginning, followed by that thesis. The third thing you want to make sure is that you were on theme, that you are addressing the right theme of the essay. So if it's about labor migration, for example, that you use that in the prompt, you're talking about labor migration. If it's about attitudes toward trade and merchants, then that's what you're addressing. If it is about technology, attitudes toward technology, then you are addressing that theme in your thesis. Don't wait to talk about it in your body paragraph and just leave it out of the thesis. That needs to be right there in your argument. And lastly, well, you've seen this one before. You got to answer the prompt. Okay. Now, how do you go about doing this, especially with theme and answering the prompt? One way, at least, to get started, and I'm not saying this is, you want to just only rephrase the prompt, but you should mirror the language of the prompt. I really encourage students that you don't need to have a Rolodex of synonyms for words the College Board gives you in your head. A Rolodex was this thing where y'all won't know what it is, but you can look it up on Google. So you don't have to have this memorization of lots of different vocabulary words in your head. You simply just need to mirror the language of the prompt. If it talks about belief systems, then use that term in your thesis statement. You don't have to say religions and philosophies. It says belief systems. You can say belief systems. If it says networks of communication and exchange, that means trade networks, but you can use the terms networks of communication and exchange, right? So that make sure that you are addressing that. Eric over in the chat, no Rolodex emoji. That's sad. That should be a thing. Isn't there a fax machine emoji? Sorry, this is why you got to participate live, folks, to get involved with these. Yeah, that's a bummer. Maybe that's one we need to pitch to the emoji board. So anyways, back to this idea of mirroring the language of the prompt. We'll talk about that later, and we'll see what that can look like. But I'm not saying that copy the prompt exactly and then just tack on a few words. That's not going to do it. But use that vocabulary that the prompt uses, and it'll really make you address the prompt. It'll answer the question. I think it does. That's one thing I really encourage students to do, especially when you're getting started. Tip number four. And so this is kind of my last of these tips. Although everything in this you could maybe see as one gigantic tip. Tip 4, when in doubt, let's say that you are struggling with how to even start to frame a thesis. What I would encourage you to do is think about using reasoning processes that you're taught in AP World History Modern. The reasoning processes, we used to call these, I think, historical thinking skills, and they've changed the names. The skills of comparison. Right? How are things similar and different? Causation, what the cause and effect aspects of it. Continuity and change, what things changed, what things stayed the same, right? So think about, are the documents displaying any of these? Do we have 2 or maybe 3 different ways that the documents respond to the question, and they maybe contrast each other? Do the documents show causation, some event leading to a big something else, maybe a change? Do they show things that changed, but maybe ideas that changed, but practices that stayed the same, whatever it might be? You can really frame your argument around those processes. So I encourage you to consider, if you're just really stuck in how do I even start to approach this question, think about those 3 reasoning processes to frame an argument. I do it myself when I'm working through a DBQ or an LEQ. I think about these processes. Sometimes they're a little bit more obvious which ones they want you to use, but they're really good tools to use. All right, moving on. So when we think about your thesis and writing it, we now want to think about, like, well, how do you get there? How do you get from, understanding the prompt and these tips to actually getting an essay on the page? And I'm realizing here that because I have so much text here talking about a DBQ, I'm very short on memes here, folks. Very short on some thesis memes. If you got any good thesis memes, link them in the chat. So how do you get to this point where you're ready to write it? Well, first you want to understand what the prompt is asking you to do, right? That's the first thing. Then you want to read documents closely, right? You have at the beginning of your DBQ a 15-minute reading period. And in that 15-minute reading period, which you could take less time or more time from that, you want to read the documents closely. And I always tell my students to ask, just in your head as you read, how does each document answer the question or answer the prompt? If I had to answer the prompt with just this one document, what would it say? What would my answer be? Right? And we'll look at that in a little bit. And then as you go through and you ask that question for each document, are there any similarities in the way these documents answer the question? And this is a skill we used to call grouping of documents. It's not required anymore. You used to get points for it. And even though it's not a requirement and you don't get points for it now, I do think it helps to build strong arguments, right? Finding similar ways or similar pieces of evidence that support a single way of answering the question. And then if you have multiple ways of answering the question, you'll find that from your different documents. So start looking for similarities or, of course, differences, right? Are there any ways that documents answer the question, but maybe in very different or opposite ways? If that's the case, well, that might be an interesting way to address the prompt. Is there one document from a Mongol that is in support? Well, the Mongols probably aren't a good example because they'd all be in support of trade. Is there one? What was the DBQ last year? I can't remember. If anybody can remember, throw it in the chat. Perhaps is there one document that is in support of trade and one document that is vehemently opposed to trade? I guess I'll go with the example we're going to look at later. If so, well, that might be an interesting comparison to make and addressing the different responses. So look for those similarities, look for differences, assess the possibilities of what you could write about. You might have 5, 6 different arguments you feel like you could make to include all the documents. Choose the strongest arguments you have and use that to write your thesis. And that's where you get to the written portion. So at this point, if anybody has any questions, feel free to, again, throw it up in the chat. Everybody's super quiet today. If you have questions about how to teach this or any specific questions about thesis statement, that's what we're here for. So the next thing we want to do and kind of take the second half of this stream to do is to look at a sample DBQ. And today we're going to use one that was compiled by our very own Melissa. So thanks so much to her for putting this thing together, allowing us to have some common language and some common themes to talk about DBQs with. And so we're very thankful to her. And certainly for anybody watching these videos live here or on a replay, these will hopefully help you out along the way. So this sample DBQ, or this DBQ that Melissa has compiled, here is the prompt. That's what we're starting with here, okay? And it says, develop an argument that evaluates the extent to which cultural traditions or belief systems affected the attitudes toward merchants and trade in the period 1200 to 1600. Okay, so let's break down this prompt, shall we? And I think the best thing to do in order to understand a prompt is really to break it down into parts. And so we'll go through each one. The first thing that you get here, and really the first couple phrases are going to be pretty consistent nowadays in the document-based question. Almost always they're going to say, develop an argument that evaluates the extent to which something happens, something from our course guide, our key concepts, but something that are connected to what you're learning using documents that you probably have not seen before. So to develop an argument, what that just means is that you need to have a historically defensible claim supported by evidence, right? That's what an argument is. You need to have a solid thesis and a line of reasoning that you're supporting throughout your essay. Now that needs to evaluate the extent to which these cultural traditions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So when you see that term, evaluate the extent to which, what it's asking you to do is sort of kind of weigh the importance of what is happening. Maybe was one aspect of your answer more significant than another in whatever outcome you reach? In this prompt, for example, did certain belief systems have more of an effect on attitudes toward trade than others, right? That might be one way to evaluate the extent to which these belief systems affected attitudes. So it's asking you sort of to weigh your options a little bit, to show that you're doing some judgment of significance of your claims. All right, so we're going to develop an argument which evaluates the extent to which cultural traditions or belief systems. All right, so what does that mean? When we're talking about belief systems, we're talking about philosophies, we're talking about religion and how they might affect society. Cultural traditions kind of maybe even extend beyond that. These might be customs. It could be art traditions. It could be, well, any host of art, music, drama, literature, whatever it might be. So we're thinking about these kind of two things together. Now, most of the documents that we're going to see are going to kind of point more toward the belief systems and religion. But you have a little bit more that you can bring in, especially if you perhaps know something about a specific culture that might fit in with this. It also helps to capture more of a cultural tradition that you might say with like the Chinese governmental system. You might consider that a cultural tradition. So very broad here. It's some really broad terms being used. Now, how did that affect the attitudes toward trade and merchants? All right, so we are looking perhaps for the extent of change in attitudes, right? Maybe it's a change in continuity. What ways did the attitudes change? And in some ways, did they stay the same and not change? Perhaps we're going to compare how much one religion affected attitudes versus another religion. So think about the different ways as you go through the documents. If you look at them on your own, clicking on them in the resources below, think about how we might compare them, the way these attitudes were affected. Again, I go back so I'm going to go back a few slides here. I go back to these three reasoning processes. Are we comparing the way belief systems affected attitudes? Maybe some did it quite a bit. Maybe some had no effect at all. Are we talking about it as a cause for a change? Maybe some change in the religion led to a change in attitudes. Or are we looking for perhaps ways that maybe a religion changed its perspective on trade over time and some did not change at all? So that's what I tend to want to gravitate toward. Now, at this point, I want to say, we haven't looked at the sources. We don't know. This is a brainstorming process. I'm speaking this out loud, so it's taking certainly a lot longer than it would if you're doing this all in your head. This is something that would take maybe a minute to go through and make sure that you're really understanding the prompt. The last thing we have here is our time period, 1200 to 1600. That's going to be especially important because as we think about each aspect of the prompt, we also have to think about contextualization that leads into our thesis. And so knowing the time period we're talking about here is important in that. It also will clue us into what things we should introduce in the thesis. What religions are around from 1200 to 1600? What is going on with merchants and trade in this time period? Certainly, we know the Mongols are around. You have the height of Silk Road trade, growing Indian Ocean trade, Europeans starting to sail across the Atlantic and into the Indian Ocean by the end of this time period. So just absolutely booming trade. But this isn't a video on contextualization. So let's go and dive into the documents. Now, for sake of time, there is no way I can go through all of these documents. So I will leave it to you to look at them on your own. I'm going to present here, though, basically what my summary is and my first pass of these documents, what it looked like or what I started to think about. And I approached it in the same exact way that that I am asking, that I'm telling you will work for you. And that is, think about how the documents answer the prompt. What are the ways that they show cultural traditions or belief systems affecting attitudes towards merchants and trade? All right, so I'm going to throw it up here and we'll kind of walk through these documents. In the top left, we're going to keep the prompt up here, and then we're going to kind of go through the notes that I took on paper, and just kind of what I probably would have handwritten as I went. So, again, going through these really quickly because really I want to spend time thinking about how we can group these together and find similarities in the way they answer the question. So what you have with document one is an image. It's a picture of the Buddha and Bodhisattvas blessing merchants. So these merchants are bringing gifts and the Buddha and Bodhisattvas are accepting these gifts as sort of perhaps a religious tribute. Now, I want to bring in some info. I probably would bring in some information I know about this. I know, what do I know about the spread of Buddhism? If you look at the sourcing information for each of these documents, it gives you a general year, a little bit of background on the source. This was from around the year 800. But what do we know about Buddhism and its spread? It spread typically along trade routes, along with merchants. So as merchants moved, so did the religion. And so there is kind of a symbiosis there between the spread of Buddhism and perhaps trade itself. There's also kind of ripe for sourcing there a little bit, because you have this beautiful piece of art that's showing tribute being given and blessings being returned on these merchants. Well, perhaps this was a little piece of religious propaganda encouraging merchants to give to the temple, what have you. So there's a lot of stuff that can go on there. Now, what I want to think about is my thesis statement, right? At this point, I have not crafted what the answer is going to be. So I want to think, well, what does this document say about how a belief system, in this case Buddhism, affected the attitudes toward merchants? And here we see a very accepting attitude, right? So we want to think about the context in which the source was created, and the time period that it's made, and the fact how Buddhism spread. Overall, we see a pretty accepting view of merchants and trade, which would have also encouraged more trade, perhaps creating more wealth, which in turn is being donated to the temple in the image. Now, I know that we're going to go through, because I'm going to move on to document 2 here. But what I will say is, if you want to look more specifically at that document, go to Melissa's presentation from last week. She did an excellent job, and she talked about that document in much more detail. That was really the only one she addressed in that much detail, though she will be looking at them more. So if you're looking along on the Google Doc of this DBQ, you will see that the second document is actually a secondary source. It's from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and it's writing about 10th century China and Confucianism and the government there. So we kind of have a cultural tradition of this Confucian bureaucracy. You also have like Confucianism maybe as a belief system, kind of philosophy for guiding, not really a religion. So, but more so, philosophical tradition. So it would fit into that cultural tradition. And in this source, it talks primarily about scholar officials, that those bureaucrats who were highly favored in Confucianism because they helped to create order and take care of the people and really make sure the government did its job. But one thing that stands out in this source is that the attitude toward merchants and trade is not very positive. It actually says that these scholar officials who are running the government discouraged entrepreneurial endeavor. So it discouraged, the entrepreneurial spirit that kind of underpins Silicon Valley in our country. They discouraged the accumulation of wealth with the Confucian admonition that acceptance of limitations leads to happiness, right? So the fact that they're almost in this way discouraging this wealth accumulation and lowering the status of merchants. And we can also bring in some outside information if we remember that merchants occupied the kind of lowest rung of the Confucian hierarchy. So that's something to think about. In the first document, we have something that seems to be very accepting of merchants and trade, perhaps even encouraging this, because perhaps it's beneficial to the spread of the religion. And then in document 2, a discouragement, because it goes against the kind of the moral center of Confucianism. All right. So already we're seeing kind of 2 different ways to answer this question. Document 3. Now here we have Thomas Aquinas, Catholic saint, in one of his major works, Summa Theologica. And he is writing primarily about the morality of merchant practices. And he comes at it with a relatively, at least in my read through, again, we're looking at these, you're probably looking at these sources very quickly. It should basically stand out. Here he calls the practice of merchants increasing prices more than perhaps they need to be, maybe kind of medieval price gouging here. He's saying that it is sinful. He even uses that term. He says it's unjust and unlawful, but this thinking about this as something that perhaps even amounts to sin, right? Taking advantage of your fellow Christian. And we could think about early Catholicism and its prohibitions of even charging interest on loans, for example. But yeah, he says it's altogether sinful to have recourse to deceit in order to sell a thing. So he's kind of equating the practices of merchants in trade with deceitfulness and immorality, which fits closer with document 2 than document 1. So already maybe we're getting a couple of different piles here. Oh, sorry, went too fast. Ignore that. Document 4 is from a Muslim scholar, Ibn Khaldun, very famous medieval Muslim historian. And in this document, we have kind of a middle ground almost. This idea that trade is a necessity that is allowed, and certainly we might want to think about the context of the development of Islam and the importance of trade in Muslim communities. In fact, the Prophet of Islam being a trader himself, it is allowed, but there is a kind of a strand here of warning, perhaps. Trade is necessary and it is permissible, but there might be some caveats there. Ibn Khaldun mentions that the nature of trade often is one that is deceitful, it's evasive. And he says those qualities can lead to a decrease and weakening in virtue and manliness. So this idea that if one is not very conscious of his trading practices and trading perhaps in line with what the religion prescribes, that yes, immorality could result. But he is important to note, specifically knowing the history of Islam and the importance of trade in the Islamic world, that nope, it is still permissible, especially because you're giving, as long as you give people the goods they pay for. But maybe one needs it's maybe a soft warning here against it. So that might even kind of be a middle ground between documents 1 and then documents 2 and 3. To speed up a little bit here, document 5, we see kind of a shift. Italian merchants, presumably Christian, they're talking about Our Lady. We definitely see in this case, Italian merchants, which we know Italy being an important trade center, hopefully we can bring to the table. Italian merchants, 14th century, late 1300s, really going to start to expand their trade. At the beginning of the Renaissance. Here we have a very different view of trade, maybe than what we saw with Aquinas. Instead of a practice being sinful, we see a shift in attitudes toward trade. So this would be a change that I might highlight in my essay, thinking about how this addresses it. The merchants here are embracing trade. In fact, they see their riches as a blessing of God. Now, the mother is somewhat concerned about their incessant drive for wealth. There is a letter from the merchant's mother that says, "Pray toil not so hard, only for the good of strangers. Let some remembrance of you remain here and someone to pray for God on your behalf." So religion is still quite important in this community. But what we see here is that the merchants, in a letter placing an order, say that God is on the side of merchants. And so here we see a use of religion more in support of trade. And our last 2 documents, document 6 shows Turkish trade customs, talks about the fairness of trade. It is very evident that in this Islamic court, this Islamic realm, that trade is still popular. It's still a necessity and something that is supported. In fact, this court decision is in an Islamic court, so it's actually you have religion combining with government, and so and they are ruling on matters of trade. So there's definitely a support for trade here, but fair trade. And it talks about the fact that one man broke a long-standing custom, and the court case leads to an admonition of him. They say, don't do that anymore. We're going to reestablish these norms because trade's important. So that kind of fits a little bit with document 4, right? This idea that Islam, as with its history of supporting merchants, is continuing to support merchants, but for those who practice morally, perhaps maybe following Islamic law or the Quran. And document 7 is another document that looks at China, or that comes from China. And it is a Neo-Confucian book of moral instruction, again, focusing on the morality aspect of this cultural tradition of Confucianism. And in it, it talks about fair trade and how to conduct business. But it sets moral guidelines. And in a way, it really depends how you read this document and how you want to use it as evidence. In my reading of it, I saw this as more of issuing moral guidelines based on a mistrust of merchants and traders, right? We need to establish these guidelines, not because we are necessarily approving of what you do, but so that you can become better people, right? So it talks about do not use short measure when selling and long measure when buying. So already kind of right off the bat, it's assuming maybe deceitful practices of merchants. And it is encouraging them to have pity on the poor and reduce price, a very kind of Confucian idea of taking care of others. Do not refuse to come to terms. So sort of an admonition again of these ideas of trade. Now, I know what you might be thinking if you're sticking it out here. Aren't we supposed to be writing a thesis statement? Well, so much of your thesis, at least in the way I like to teach it, is reliant on you understanding what the documents say and how they answer the question. Once you get to that point, you can start thinking about in what similar ways do they answer the question? How many different, what we used to call groups, can we make? Now, if you have one document all by yourself, nowadays you can definitely use that document, but you're going to have a much stronger support for a thesis, or as much stronger argument and evidence to support it if you are using all your documents, of course, which everyone should be doing, but you can use multiple documents to support each claim. So if we go through this, I've started thinking about how we might group some of these documents together. So I went too far, sorry. For example, one of the things as we read this that stood out to me was that outright rejection of merchants, of merchants and trade. So these would be cultural traditions and belief systems that rejected merchants and trade on moral grounds, right? Confucianism and Aquinas with Christianity seemed to see this action as sinful or somehow working against the good of society. But other documents said different things. For example, documents 4 and 6, these Islamic documents, seemed to say that trade was permitted as a necessity, even though there might be some dishonest practices. So you need to be very careful, perhaps, as you go about trade, but it is still a very important part of culture, and it's still encouraged as long as you do it by the law, right? Ibn Khaldun says in his source that it is a natural means of livelihood, right? So, and it is the religious law allows the methods of merchants to keep going. And then you have this Turkish Islamic court that is, again, condoning trade, but done fairly. So Again, trade is permitted. It's maybe, we might even use the term encouraged as a necessity, despite those possible dishonest practices. And then I looked at, a couple other sources that said, well, wealth of merchants as a sign, maybe a sign of religious blessing even. And I looked at documents 1 and 5 that kind of agree with this idea of these wealthy merchants being blessed by the Buddha and Bodhisattvas, and these Italian merchants in document 5 claiming to be blessed by God because they are accumulating this wealth and having such success. So those are 3 very different responses, right? Outright rejection, the support of trade, although with the idea that morality should guide it, and morality linked in that belief system of Islam. And then over here, this idea of religion used to justify the existence and proliferation of trade. So kind of 3 stages that we see across the board. You could group the documents in different ways. You could look at them by religion, for example. You could do a paragraph on Confucianism and think about how Confucianism, that cultural tradition, affected attitudes towards merchants and trade. You could compare that to how Islam supported trade as a custom. And then you could compare that even to Christianity and then Buddhism, right? Maybe 4 paragraphs there. So think about how you can construct your argument. You could also group based on the idea of rationalizing your attitudes on trade using religious arguments. We see that with Islam, Buddhism, and with the later Christian document. So there are a lot of different other ways that you can kind of group these documents to arrive at an answer. These are not the only ways, but these are just several that, when I went through, stood out to me. If I had had more time and I could have kept going through them, I probably could have come up with an even longer list. I think perhaps one intriguing way would be to do it by religion and really compare how much each religion changed its views over time or stayed the same. It would be a little bit harder to do with the Buddhist document because we don't have a matching one for that. But once we have started thinking about possible responses, the way the documents answer the question, now we're getting to the place where we can write a thesis. Again, me talking through this took 20 minutes. In your head, while you're reading the documents, you're gathering information, this is going to take roughly 15 minutes. Maybe up to 20 if you want to be bold and steal some time away from writing or the LEQ. But once you understand that question, and you dive into the documents, you should start arriving at what that thesis can be. And you should hopefully can have that introduction thesis written maybe in the first 5 or 10 minutes of your essay, and you can support it with evidence in the remainder. So let's go back to our prompt: develop an argument that evaluates the extent to which cultural traditions or belief systems affected attitudes towards merchants and trade in the period 1200 to 1600. And I have a lot of different possible responses: rejection of merchants on moral grounds, trade as a necessity, despite some maybe possible moral qualms, the embracing of wealth as a sign of religious blessing, and then a few others. But I'm really going to stick to those first 3 because those really stood out to me. Kind of, if we're evaluating the extent to which these attitudes, these belief systems affected attitudes, I think comparing kind of this spectrum is the way to go, or the way I want to go in this one. So what this led me to do was craft a thesis along those lines. And by the way, guys, I'm coming up near the end. So if you got questions, go ahead and start populating them and thinking about it. So this is kind of a longer form thesis. And I kind of purposefully did not do a whole lot of editing it down because I wanted to kind of reflect what you might get to on the test and the experience you all might have. But this is what I came up with. All right. So again, I want you to think about how these answers that are found in the thesis connect to the documents. Because when I get into my body in my essay, I'm going to be using those documents and those groups to make these arguments or support these arguments. So while some cultural traditions and belief systems, such as Confucianism, actively warned against the accumulation of wealth through trade, right? So remember the Confucian documents, and we probably even could bring in Aquinas here, right? Actively warning against the accumulation of wealth through trade, right? How did belief systems affect it? They actively warned against it and the accumulation of this wealth. So while these cultural traditions and belief systems actively warned against, other societies reliant on trade use their belief systems to rationalize the behavior of merchants despite moral concerns. So here, what I wanted to do, because I know that in the first part of this, I'm going to use the two Chinese Confucian documents 2 and 7, and I'm going to use that Aquinas document 3. The second part of this argument, other societies relying on trade use their beliefs to rationalize behavior of merchants despite moral concerns. I'm going to bring in our Islamic documents there. Still, others use religion as a means to promote trade and the activities of merchants. And here I'm going to bring in that later Christian document from Italy and really do some contextualization work to talk about the importance of trade in Italy. And then I would bring in the Buddhist document and the importance of trade with Buddhism. I might also bring in the Islamic documents again, maybe the second one a little bit more, to talk about how Islamic courts promoted trade through their rulings and encouraging fairness, right? So one thing I would remind you is that you can use documents more than once, and you can use them as part of multiple arguments. So when I'm thinking about this, I kind of have a 3-part thesis here. And you notice I could not fit it, or maybe I just didn't try hard enough, but I couldn't fit it in one sentence. So I have kind of a complex thesis here, but one that says, well, some of these belief systems actively warned against it, said no trade, not good. Others, they found ways to rationalize it, right? They had some moral concerns, but they still found ways to say, well, it's okay, it's a necessity. And then others we see in this time period promote trade and the activities of merchants outright, and they use religion as a way to do so. So that's kind of where I got this from. And I can only arrive at this thesis by thinking about how the documents answer the question. Now, there are a few things here that could make this thesis better. For example, I started off by telling you that chronology and geography is something that you should include. I did not put this in here. I assumed that it would be something that would be found in the introduction and the contextualization, although you could very easily add from 1200 to 1600, while some cultural traditions and belief systems across Afro-Eurasia, which is where all these documents are from, such as Confucianism, warned against it. And you could go on, but it might make it a little bit more wordy than I've already created here. So that is basically how we get to a thesis statement. That is the path. In this video, it took about 30 minutes of time to go through this document. But remember that when you're doing this in your head, it speeds things up. Don't get too down on yourself if when you start working on these thesis statements for DBQs, you start working on DBQs, that this is a hard process. Remember, I've been teaching this course for years and years. I've read for the document-based question. I teach it year in and year out. If you did not come up with these same arguments, that's okay. You may have come up with equally valid arguments and groupings of these documents that will help you arrive at a thesis statement. Of course, feel free to practice these thesis statements. Think about different ways perhaps that you could write them. How could you group these documents differently? You will also be able to do that as you continue through this series on the DBQ. So when you look at breaking down these documents and maybe seeing more specifically while looking at the documents how I arrived at some of the conclusions I made, looking at how you build an argument, how you support your argument with evidence. Those are things that, of course, you'll have the opportunity to do later on in this session. Nobody has put any questions in here yet, but I'll give a couple minutes if anybody has questions they need to ask. You can go ahead and populate it, considering if you have any questions or just concerns or things that you're worried about, right? Is there anything anybody's worried about with this? Be happy to answer. I do want to remind everybody about some other presentations that we have coming soon. Tomorrow we have 2 presentations: changing social hierarchies, so looking at how they're changing in this time period that we're learning about here in Fiveable. Resisting empires on land and sea. That seems pretty fantastic. Seems very exciting stuff. And then some student-led presentations this weekend. Again, encourage you to go back and watch some replays. It doesn't look like there are too many questions tonight, so we'll wrap it up. We're going to hit about an hour exactly. If you have questions, certainly see me. I'll be back in a couple weeks with another topic. Looking forward to visiting with you again. So that was doing the DBQ, and that's how you craft a grade A 1-point thesis. Have a great day.